And myself, I come to this out of my own personal experience. I walked into the operating room one day when I was doing my anesthesiology residency program, and I reported for duty. The doctor at the desk said, "Oh, Klesig, glad you're here. We'd like you to go up to ICU. There's a brain dead man. We'd like you to bring him down and give him anesthesia for an organ harvesting." And honestly, Leslie, it kind of caught me flat-footed. I remembered vaguely I'd heard something about brain death during my training, but honestly, I didn't have all the facts at my fingertips. So I asked him, I said, "Brain death, huh? Is there something different about this that I should know?" And, he laughed and he rolled his eyes and he said, "Just be sure someone has actually declared him brain dead. You know how eager the transplant team can be." Not what I wanted to hear. But I went up to find my patient. He was a young man. He had been in a motorcycle accident. He was a young man about my own age at the time, and he'd sustained a severe traumatic head injury. And the neurologist had indeed checked all the boxes on the brain death diagnosis protocol and had determined that he was somehow dead. But when I went to see my patient, he didn't look dead. He was warm. He was pink. He had stable vital signs, good heart rate, good blood pressure. He had nearly 100% oxygen saturation in his blood. Quite frankly, he looked like every other intensive care unit patient that I had anesthetized, and in fact, better than most. He wasn't on much for drips or infusions. So I went back down to the operating room and I found the staff anesthesiologist who was going to be supervising me for the case. And I presented these facts to him. And he said, "Okay, Klesig, what's your anesthetic plan of care?" I was so brainwashed myself at the time. I honestly told him, I said, "I'll give him, I think, a paralyzing agent so he won't move during the surgery," right? How is it that a dead person might move during surgery? But, I was following along with what I've been taught. And I said, and I think in addition to paralyzing him, I think I'll give him some fentanyl as a potent painkiller that might blunt any swings in the heart rate or blood pressure that might damage the organs. So my attending looked at me and he said, "Okay, I think that sounds good. Are you going to give a drug to block consciousness?" And I was stunned. I was confused. I asked him, "Why would I do that? Isn't he dead?" And my attending just looked at me and said, "Why don't you give him a consciousness blocker just in case?" And he walked away.
Wow.
That made no sense to me whatsoever. But, here we are. I mean, if you've ever been to a hospital, you know that operating room time is money. I had a surgical team, an operating room team, all waiting on me to bring this patient down. And, as I was being trained, it didn't make sense to me, but I assumed that someone, in charge here had figured this out, and it must make sense. It must just be that I was confused. So, I ignored my gut. I ignored the fact that it didn't make sense, and I just did what I was told. Mm-hmm. And I brought the young man down. I gave him the anesthetic we had proposed. I'm here to tell you he responded to surgery just like anyone else. He required exactly the same types and amounts of anesthesia. And at this point, I have to say I believe in my heart that I participated in what actually was a medical homicide. That man was certainly neurologically disabled, but he was in no way dead. And it is my regret over this incident that motivated me to look into, the original source documents to further investigate what is going on with this idea of brain death and these other types of donation.